All right, so it's 2018. It is what is it, November 2nd? Now it's November 3rd, and 12:40 or so in the morning, and I'm preparing for my flight. I'm waiting for my flight here at the Dammam airport. And this is the end of a 2-year journey. I came here 2 years ago to teach English, and now I'm finishing up my stint here. So it's been a good 2 years. It's been a productive 2 years. I mean, it's been a really good 2 years. I came here in hopes of traveling and seeing this part of the world, or being able to access this part of the world, including Europe and Africa and also the Middle East. And with my time here in 2017, I traveled to 17 countries. I traveled to many of the Middle Eastern countries that were accessible. And I traveled to Europe for the first time. I visited my cousins in Germany, and I did a lot. I did a lot of traveling, and I accomplished a lot. And now it's time to say goodbye to Saudi Arabia. And I'm saying goodbye to Saudi Arabia from Dammam on the eastern province, or in the eastern region, eastern province. Yep, that's it. So that's it.
Window seat surfing on the wing. As an adolescent, I dreamed of big things. Climb to the top of the mountain to see the scene. Petty rap don't want me to have anything. I'm the captain, no jet lag. Boeing jet swag.
Between August 2016 and November 2018, I lived in Saudi Arabia. It's also known as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I lived in the eastern province in a city known as Dammam. Even today, I'm not exactly sure of the name, because for mailing purposes, for daily purposes, the region or the area where I lived, what we called it, changed. Okay, so it was known as Dammam, but then there was also Daran. So I don't know where Dammam begins and where Daran, begins, or where Dammam ends and where Daran begins. I'm not quite sure of that. And then there is this Al-Khobar region, and Al-Khobar was used for mailing purposes. Excuse me. So we were absolutely in the eastern region, where there was, we were near the sea. There were beaches nearby, so you could go to the shoreline. And this, but the names, I can't be very specific because I don't know. Was it Dammam, Daran, Al-Khobar, or a combination of all three? I don't know. It's sort of like here in Los Angeles, where does Culver City actually begin? We have La Cienega, which is a major thoroughfare. And if you cross La Cienega, you seem to be moving into Culver City. But is that really where it begins? I don't know. But the further west you go, you do actually get a sense. You do feel like you're in Culver City, especially when you're downtown Culver City. But where does it actually begin? I don't know. Same thing with with Inglewood. You know, you're at one moment you're like in South Central Los Angeles, and then the next minute you cross over a street, I don't know which street that is, and then you're in Inglewood. Well, I will say in Los Angeles we do have a sign that marks where you are entering into Inglewood. For instance, if you're driving down La Brea and you cross that sign and you pass that sign that says Inglewood, okay, that is definitively a marker that says now you're in Inglewood. You're no longer in, you know, South Central Los Angeles or what have you. But this is about Saudi Arabia, not Los Angeles. I only brought up Los Angeles to compare. But the point that I want to make about life in Saudi Arabia is this. I was aware that September 11th was carried out by Saudi nationals. I was aware of, you know, I'd heard the stories of suicide bombings by, you know, Muslims. So when I went to Saudi Arabia in 2016, these ideals of Muslim suicide bombers and terrorists loomed large in my imagination, in my ideals about Saudi nationals. Excuse me. And so I was afraid. Fear was ever present. At that time when I went to Saudi Arabia. Now, things didn't change for me once I arrived in Saudi Arabia. It isn't as if the experience of being in Saudi Arabia immediately, you know, my fear dissipated. No, that fear was, as I said, it was ever present. Especially, you see, I lived in Saudi Arabia for 2 years. I would have to say for the first year that I lived in Saudi Arabia, that fear was very strong. By the second year, that fear was diminished. It was muffled, if you will. For instance, during my first year, I recall driving around Saudi Arabia. Sometimes I was driven around Saudi Arabia. Other times I was driving myself, because I was a civilian military contractor in Saudi Arabia, and part of our package, our employment package, included access to a vehicle. We shared a vehicle, but I was a car captain, so I held the keys and I was able to drive, of course, my team, but also I was able to take the car and drive myself to the supermarket and wherever I needed to go. Everyone had access to the vehicle. If someone needed the vehicle, I had to relinquish the keys. I had to surrender the keys to one of my teammates. However, I was responsible for those keys. And so after my teammate returned from his shopping trips, then he would surrender the keys to me. Excuse me. And so sometimes I would drive myself. Other times I was on a team with another lead driver, and maybe that lead driver was driving us around. This fear that I had manifested itself in this way. Anytime we would pull up to a stoplight and we had to sit and wait for that light to change, I always thought that the car to my right or left or behind us or just near us, especially if the car was older, an older model, I always thought that that car was equipped with a bomb. This was my fear. And I looked and I thought, that's the one, it's going to blow up. Well, I'm here telling this story, so that didn't happen. But because I was informed, or because I was aware of suicide bombers and terrorists, and that was the prevailing ideal I had of Saudis. Anytime a car driven by Saudis would, pull up alongside us at a stoplight, I was afraid that, that car had a bomb. It was equipped with a bomb. Now, I brought up Los Angeles initially, and to compare that experience with Los Angeles, it's like when you've heard of the stories of Christopher Wallace, or the notorious Big, B-I-G, where he was parked at a light, waiting for the light to turn, and a car pulled up alongside him. And I'm referring to in Los Angeles, this happened, and a car, someone from that vehicle shot into Notorious Big's car. And so in Los Angeles, when you hear of stories like this, it informs you of what potentially could happen. Of course, he's a high-profile individual, and for the regular citizen who doesn't have any affiliation or hasn't made it known, of their affiliations, then it's not really the greatest concern for one to think, oh, someone's after me. I mean, that's just paranoid. But knowing that people have been injured, been killed, in those manners, random road rage incidents on the streets of Los Angeles, these are the types of experiences that are comparable to that feeling I had in Saudi Arabia, because these things really did happen. And you wonder, is this it? Is this my time? And you always have to be aware of your surroundings. You always have to have situational awareness. And in Los Angeles, when pulling up to a stoplight, you are aware, you are thinking, at least for me, especially where I am, which part of the city, I think, you have to be very cautious about, who's around you, who's behind you. So there is a comparable experience in America, in Los Angeles, because the threat in Los Angeles could be gangs, it could be a thief, a robber, a carjacker. So even in Los Angeles, the experience of stopping, of waiting at the stoplight can be, stressful. And the same thing is in Saudi Arabia. For me, at least, I would pull up to the light, and I would have that same level of, you have to be aware, you have to pay attention, because you never know. And so that was my experience in Saudi Arabia. I was just fearful for at least 1 year, and I thought the cars around me were just going to explode. But that didn't happen. It did not happen. And because it did not happen, because it didn't happen, I wouldn't say that, the fear diminished. My stress levels, were alleviated. No, it was certainly no longer at the front of my mind, because I was more comfortable and careful. In Saudi Arabia, I didn't let it, consume my imagination. but rather, yes, I found a way to relax. And Saudi Arabia was a very pleasant country. So outside of basically the fear-mongering U.S. media and the portrayal of, bad things, outside of that, bad things did not happen while I was in Saudi Arabia. Now, outside of the fear-mongering U.S. media, I mean, if you consume, news on a regular basis, you will probably get a sense of, oh, something bad, can happen. I remember I walked into a store the other day, just last week, and a young woman saw me enter, and it must have been my appearance or just something about me that made her sort of freeze when she saw me. And I thought, that's really unnecessary. If she knew me, knew my character, and knew my values, she would know that I don't pose any threat to her. I'm just like her. I'm another shopper, just there to look around, browse. But maybe she had seen something in the media that said, oh, someone who looks like him, could potentially pose a threat. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Anyhow, just by traveling, I've learned to check my assumptions, check my expectations, because the countries I've traveled to have taught me things that are antithetical, the opposite of what I had heard previously. And in that sense, traveling has been enriching, enlightening, and a wonderful education. And Saudi Arabia was, I failed to mention that there have been events, horrible, violent, tragic events that did occur in that region. So my fear was warranted. Things had happened. There was, for instance, I believe, a bombing at a U.S. Air base. Maybe it wasn't an air base. It was definitely a military, dorm installation. So that occurred one year. There was a terrorist attack that claimed the lives of several foreign nationals. The details of which are quite graphic. They include the beheading of at least one person, and then their body being dragged, down the streets, the same streets that I traveled down in, during my time when I was living there. Those were the same streets that those things happened on. And of course, I was curious. So much time had passed, but I was curious enough to drive to search for, those locations to see what it was like. At least I felt comfortable enough to drive to search for these infamous locations where these tragic, horrific things, occurred. Curiosity tourism, and, whatever, however you describe it, dark tourism maybe. So I did actually drive there. I didn't see anything, of course, so many years had passed, but just knowing something truly awful occurred in that building, which was like a hotel, very scary. And then lastly, as far as living in Saudi Arabia, there was always talk of, what do you do in the event of something happening? And so I really never felt very comfortable. Where we lived, we had tall walls. We lived in a compound. And for the first I'd say maybe 6 months, our our compound, maybe 3 to 6 months. The first 3 to 6 months, our compound was heavily guarded. We had military guards with, high-powered weapons, like maybe Kevlar vests and helmets, and they were ready for action. And these men were positioned. Their post was right outside of our gates, and they would check our vehicles with mirrors. They'd slide the mirror under the vehicle in order to check if there are any bombs, under our cars and whatnot. That made us feel safer because we did have a line of defense, or at least a first line of defense. But the idea that something could happen was still very present. It was only later that, the fear diminished only a little, because of routine. Got into the routine of things. It was like nothing's happened, and there's no talk of anything that will happen, And then that same line of defense that we had in front of our compound, you see, we lost that line of defense. We had military, guys in military armor protecting us. And then there was a policy or there was a call for the military to address the Yemen, the war, or the conflict with Yemen. And so all of these men who were doing basically civilian work, guarding residences, compounds where, civilians lived, they were called to war, to action. And so all of our protection, the guys who protected us, they were taken and they were sent to fight the war, fight with Yemen. They went to the conflict zone, and we felt naked. Now we had, plain clothes. No, they weren't plain clothes, but these were just some regular uniformed security guards. Very, they lacked the intimidation factor, and they were supposed to protect us. Now, the best they could do is call for help. The only weapon they had was a walkie-talkie and access to a phone. So we definitely, I think the fear factor increased when the troops were called to duty. So many things happened while we were in Saudi Arabia, while I was there, and it was pleasant. Driving in Saudi Arabia was pretty wild because, there were some speeders, some fast drivers, and the rules of the road in California, they didn't apply in Saudi Arabia. The rules of Saudi Arabia, reign supreme. I recall noticing that Saudis really enjoy American cars, especially General Motors or GM cars, or GMC. I think they call them GMC. Chevrolets. Yeah, Saudis love those cars. All right, we'll stop there. I think that's about right. So I want to recap my trip. Wow, I didn't take a picture. So this year has been a very spiritual year for me. I have seen my birth date, 109, in various forms in many different places all throughout the year, and it has always encouraged me, and I've always used it as an
as a sign, as an omen of good luck, of positive reinforcement whenever I see that. So I'm coming to the close of this year. It's December 29th, 2017, and the last time, maybe not the last time this year, but the last time I saw 109 was when I left the airport after returning from what is my last trip in 2017 from Sri Lanka. When I exited the airport, I hailed a taxi, and the taxi that picked me up had the license plates 109, the first three numbers. I saw that and I just said to myself, wow, look, here it is again. And every time I've seen 109, it's just, it's a huge coincidence, just a huge thing. It's a huge thing for me. And the frequency with which I see it, and it's just something I trip off of, often.
Window seat surfing on the wing. As an adolescent, I dreamed of big things. Climb to the top of the mountain to see the scene. Petty rap don't want me to have anything. I'm the captain, no jet lag. Boeing jet swag.